Welcome to this explainer, where we are going to, quite literally, dismantle your preconceived notions of reality and completely rebuild them using the truly fascinating mechanics of the P2.3 framework. Now, if you've ever found yourself wondering how the universe manages to construct something solid out of all that underlying quantum indeterminacy, well, you are absolutely in the right place. Today, we're zeroing in on the actual mechanics of contact and void participation roles. We are going to see exactly how, within this specific framework, matter isn't made of tiny, permanent little beads, but is rather this incredibly dynamic, living pattern of participation. Let's get into it. Okay, so here's a quick look at our roadmap for today. We're going to cover not beads, but roles, defining contact and void, the interface geometry engine, particles as persistent patterns, and finally, what happens when the system jams. All right, kicking things off with section 1, not beads, but roles. You know those old high school chemistry diagrams? The ones showing little billiard ball atoms just kind of floating around in empty space? Yeah, we need to completely forget those. That traditional view is out the window here. Instead, the P2.3 framework asks us to view reality as a fluid, dynamic pattern. Think about it. The substrate of the universe isn't just some passive, empty container. It's a deeply active field. So what we typically call a particle is actually just a persistent pattern of participation within that active substrate. It's not a permanent physical thing. It's an ongoing, continuous event. And that brings us to this crucial takeaway, perfectly summarized by this quote right here. Contact and void are roles, not substances. This is absolutely key. We are talking about behaviors, right? Not physical ingredients that you could just scoop up and put into a jar. When we discuss the fundamental building blocks of reality in this framework, we are strictly tracking how the substrate acts, not what it's permanently made of. Moving right along to section 2, let's actually define what we mean by these roles of contact and void. So let's look at the first role, contact. I want you to think of contact not as physical objects literally bumping into and touching each other, but rather as a highly coordinated network of active participation. Honestly, think of it like a flash mob. The people in a flash mob aren't permanently glued together, are they? No, but their coordinated participation creates a solid, recognizable structure for a brief moment in time. When the substrate is in a contact active state, it's participating in a specific scale regime in a very organized way. And it's exactly that coordination that gives the universe its structural stability, its stiffness, and its recurrence. Basically, it's the architecture of the whole pattern. Now, on the flip side of that coin is void. And guys, I seriously cannot stress this enough. Void is absolutely not empty space. It just isn't. It is an almost full, highly active medium. The key difference here is that it's simply not participating in the current contact regime. Think of one of those little sliding tile puzzles. That one empty square isn't nothing, right? It's the vital free volume, the slack, that allows all the other tiles to shift and rearrange. Void is that vital breathing room the system absolutely needs in order to function and change. And when you combine these two roles, we arrive at this really profound realization. Geometry itself is not some pre-existing static space or an invisible grid. The geometry of our universe is actually recovered from the stable statistical pattern of this ongoing contact and void turnover. The physical shape of reality is literally just the architecture of this continuous, rapid exchange of participation roles happening across different scales. It's kind of mind-blowing when you really think about it. Okay, on to section 3, the interface geometry engine. Let's see what happens when this whole thing is up and running. Let's map out the core states of this substrate. As we discussed, we have our contact active and void active regions. But crucially, you also have the interface. That's the boundary where roles are actively being swapped and exchanged. And then importantly, there are states of failure. You have loosened, which is where contact is degrading, and over-constrained, which is where the crucial slack we talked about is completely exhausted, and the whole system essentially jams up. Understanding these specific states is exactly how we track the health and the movement of any pattern in the framework. So this geometry engine runs on a continuous, relentless cycle of turnover, and it follows 3 distinct steps: maintenance, recruitment, and release. Void regions are recruited into contact, and then old contact regions are released back into void. It is very much like watching a massive stadium wave passing through a crowd. The wave itself moves completely around the stadium and it maintains a persistent identity, but the actual people, the constituents making up the wave, are constantly standing up and sitting down. The overall pattern persists through total constituent replacement. And here is the ultimate punchline of the entire concept. What we experience every day as solid matter, the literal chair you're sitting on right now, the screen you're looking at, is actually just the stable cycling happening right at the boundary between contact and void. Matter is not a frozen, static thing. It is a living, bounded recurrence. It's a continuous cycle of participation that maintains its identity over time, right there at the interface. Which leads us perfectly into Section 4, particles as persistent patterns. So if matter is just a cycle, how do particles actually form? Well, subatomic particles aren't permanent fixtures. They emerge from what the framework calls a cascade grammar. Most of these coherence events are just shallow, what we call virtual-like transients. They try to form a stable pattern, but they just quickly damp out and vanish. Occasionally, a pattern manages to survive one full constituent replacement cycle. We call that a shell closure. But truly persistent particles, the ones we can measure, those are the rare threshold reaches. They are upward coherence chains that miraculously manage to achieve long-term, bounded recurrence across multiple levels without failing. It helps to think of a particle survival as this incredibly delicate accounting ledger. A persistent pattern requires a continuous, steady supply of slack from the void, just to keep turning over. If a cascade gets too greedy and consumes too much slack without recruiting more void, or if it recruits way too aggressively and hits an over-constraint ceiling, it locks up entirely. On the other hand, if it doesn't get enough slack, it essentially starves. So a single pattern running on its own is incredibly fragile. And this fragility actually provides a brilliant mechanical explanation for something you've probably heard of, particle-antiparticle pairs. See, a single closure dies off really rapidly, but a paired closure, that completely changes the game. By coupling together, these two distinct patterns can perform what's called reciprocal slack handoff. Imagine two people trying to carry a ridiculously heavy couch. When one person gets tired, the other shifts and takes the weight. They redistribute those failure pressures between them, extending their survival dramatically compared to a single pattern. So what looks like a visual symmetry in physics transforms into a pure mechanical load-sharing necessity. All right, finally, let's look at Section 5, when the system jams. What happens when we push this delicate turnover engine to its absolute limits? Let's trace out this speculative collapse pathway. We start out in a perfectly ordinary, healthy turnover regime, what the framework dubs the active Bernal basin. But as local participation demand starts to rise, we generate over-constraint pressure. Motion starts slowing down. Eventually, things hit a pre-collapse saturation point where that vital void slack is totally 100% exhausted. This forces a void collapse transition, reclassifying the slack entirely. This whole process culminates in a frozen, densely compacted state that actually mimics the mechanics you'd expect to find inside a black hole. And at this grim endpoint, which the framework classifies as a locked Z12 crystalline branch, that dynamic, living cycle of identity through replacement completely dies. The coordination packs incredibly tightly into a Z12 structure, the crystallinity goes through the roof, the capacity for any mobile pattern to relock drops to near absolute zero, and that vital contact and void turnover is entirely suppressed. The end result? It's basically a locked vacuum crystal where literally nothing can move, and dynamic persistence is replaced by a completely frozen lock-in. So, I want to leave you with this somewhat mind-bending thought to ponder today. If every single particle that makes up your body right now and every solid object sitting around you isn't actually made of a permanent physical substance, but is rather a dynamic, cyclic pattern of participation that is continuously turning over through the active void, well, are we all just a highly complex, coordinated sequence of taking turns? Because I promise you, once you start seeing reality as this continuous, fluid exchange of roles, rather than just a collection of solid, static objects, the universe simply never looks the same again. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning the substrate of reality. See you next time.